Somewhere beneath a small patch of forest on a Canadian island, a machine just picked up a signal that no one on the research team expected to see. Not a shadow, not a smudge, a straight, unmistakable line running deep under the ground. And at the very end of that line, a reading so strong that the engineer monitoring it pushed back from his desk and said one word out loud. Wait. That single moment is where this story begins. And by the time it's over, you'll understand why an entire team of scientists went quiet in a room full of equipment worth millions of dollars. If you love a good mystery, stick around because what happened next on Oak Island might be the strangest turn this 230-year-old story has ever taken. For more than 2 centuries, Oak Island has pulled people in with the same question. Is there really something valuable buried under this island, or is it one of the greatest false alarms in history? Since 1795, when 3 boys reportedly found a strange depression in the ground and started digging, treasure hunters, engineers, and dreamers have poured money, time, and in some tragic cases their lives into finding an answer. Wells have been sunk, shafts have flooded, companies have gone bankrupt, and still the island keeps its secret. That history is exactly why any new claim about Oak Island deserves a healthy amount of skepticism. And it's exactly why the team behind this latest investigation, led by geophysicist Dr. Marcus Reyes, insisted on moving slower than anyone expected. The story starts on an ordinary review day. Reyes and his small team of independent researchers have been comparing newly collected ground-penetrating radar data against decades of old survey records. Mostly routine work meant to catalog what earlier expeditions had already found. But when the first high-resolution scan loaded onto the monitor, something in the image didn't match anything in the archive. A long, straight anomaly ran through the subsurface layer, far too uniform to be a typical rock fracture. Cracks in bedrock tend to wander, branch, and taper unevenly. This line didn't do any of that. It ran nearly flat and continuous for a significant stretch before curving gently downward. The team's first instinct was caution, not excitement. Natural geology can absolutely produce misleading shapes, and Oak Island in particular has a long history of researchers getting excited over formations that later turned out to be nothing more than glacial till or old drainage channels. So instead of announcing anything, Reyes ordered a second scan using a different frequency range on the radar equipment. If the anomaly was some kind of imaging artifact or equipment glitch, changing the frequency should have made it disappear or shift. It didn't. The line reappeared in almost the same location. A third scan, run days later with a completely different ground imaging unit borrowed from a nearby university geology department, produced the same result again. At that point, the team pulled every piece of archive data they could find, old borehole logs going back decades, previous 3D geological models, and early ground survey notes from past excavation attempts. When they laid the new scan over the old records, something interesting emerged. Several old boreholes, drilled years earlier for unrelated reasons, set almost directly along the same path the new anomaly was tracing. At the time those boreholes were drilled, nobody had flagged anything unusual about them. Now, viewed in context, they lined up like breadcrumbs along a route nobody had recognized before. Reyes made the call to pause other fieldwork and bring in the full team for a closer look. Inside a cramped equipment trailer that doubled as a makeshift command center, geologists, a structural engineer, and 2 data analysts spent hours going through the combined data set. Nobody wanted to be the person who cried treasure over what might turn out to be a fault line. But the more data they layered together, the harder it became to explain the pattern as purely natural. Structural engineer Priya Anand, who had spent years analyzing underground utility corridors before joining the project, pointed out that natural fractures almost never maintain a constant width and depth over long distances the way this feature did. Something about its consistency looked engineered rather than accidental. Still, consistency alone isn't proof. So the team shifted from passive scanning to active investigation. Additional ground-penetrating radar units were deployed to map the full extent of the feature, this time aiming not just to confirm it existed, but to trace exactly where it went. Over the following days, a picture slowly built up on the team's modeling software. The anomaly wasn't isolated. It connected to what appeared to be small underground voids at several points along its length, like a corridor linking a series of small rooms. And the overall direction of that corridor pointed generally toward the area historically associated with the island's famous original excavation site, the so-called Money Pit that has drawn diggers here since the very beginning. That connection is what changed the tone in the command trailer from cautious curiosity to focused urgency. Reyes reminded everyone that correlation with the Money Pit's location didn't prove anything about treasure, gold, or historical construction. It simply meant this newly discovered feature sat in a part of the island that already had a long, complicated excavation history, which made careful documentation even more important before anyone touched a shovel. The next phase focused on the far end of the tunnel-like structure, the point where the corridor seemed to terminate. When sensors were repositioned to scan that specific spot, the readings coming back were different from anything recorded elsewhere on the island. A strong metallic signature showed up clearly against the surrounding rock, with a density high enough that the equipment's automated flagging system triggered an alert. Metal detection tools can be fooled by mineral deposits, old iron debris left behind by previous excavation attempts, or even modern equipment buried by earlier teams, so nobody treated this as confirmation of anything valuable. Reyes ordered the reading repeated using a separate device with different sensor technology. The second test came back with a similar signature. A third test, conducted a few days later after recalibrating all instruments, again produced a comparable result. With 3 independent readings pointing to the same conclusion, the team moved to physical sampling rather than relying solely on remote sensing. Careful coring began around the perimeter of the anomaly, with each drill location chosen specifically to avoid disturbing the suspected void itself. Anyone who has followed Oak Island's history knows how easily overeager digging has destroyed potential evidence in the past, so this team treated every inch of new drilling as something that could not be redone. Core samples came up in sealed tubes, each one logged with exact depth, location, and time before being sent for laboratory analysis. The first several samples looked unremarkable, ordinary layered sediment consistent with the island's known geology. But as drilling continued closer to the anomaly, the composition of the samples started to shift. Small fragments of degraded would turn up in more than one core, along with sections of stone that didn't match the natural bedding pattern of the surrounding material. In a few samples, faint metallic traces appeared as well, distinct from the natural mineral content typically found in the area. None of this, the team was careful to note, proved the presence of treasure or gold. Wood fragments could come from any number of past excavation attempts on an island that has been repeatedly dug into for well over a century. Unusual stone layering could result from long-forgotten construction work rather than anything ancient. But taken together with the radar data and the metallic readings, the physical samples added another layer of evidence that this underground feature was not simply a natural formation. To build a clearer picture of what they were dealing with, the team combined all of their data, the radar scans, the borehole comparisons, and the core sample results into a single 3D digital model. When a model finished rendering, it revealed something that gave even the more skeptical members of the team pause. The void at the end of the tunnel-like structure had unusually regular, almost symmetrical walls, a shape more consistent with a constructed space than with a naturally eroded pocket in the rock. Reyes was careful to remind the group that symmetry alone doesn't confirm human construction, since certain natural processes can occasionally produce surprisingly regular shapes. But combined with everything else the team had gathered, it was enough to justify treating the site as a high priority for extremely careful, methodical excavation. That decision changed how the entire operation ran. Heavy machinery was pulled back from the area entirely. In its place, the team adopted a slow, layer-by-layer excavation method more commonly used on sensitive archaeological digs than on typical treasure hunting operations. Every layer of soil removed was measured, photographed, and logged before the next layer was touched. Laser scanning captured the exact shape of the excavation site at each stage, creating a detailed record that could be reviewed later regardless of what, if anything, was eventually found. The goal, as Reyes repeated to the team more than once, was not simply to reach whatever lay at the end of the tunnel as quickly as possible, but to make sure that whatever evidence existed there would be preserved and properly understood rather than destroyed by rushing. Word of the discovery inevitably reached people outside the immediate team, and once it did, opinions split quickly. Some independent geologists who reviewed summaries of the data argued that the combination of a linear radar anomaly, connected underground voids, and metallic readings was hard to explain through natural processes alone, and that the site deserved serious, well-funded investigation. Other researchers urged caution, pointing out that Oak Island has produced dramatic-looking anomalies before that ultimately led nowhere, and that ground-penetrating radar in particular can be misleading in soil conditions like those found on the island. Both sides agreed on one thing. Only careful physical excavation, combined with independent laboratory verification, could settle the question one way or another. To keep the investigation credible, the team sent their wood, stone, and metal samples to multiple outside laboratories for independent analysis, deliberately keeping each lab unaware of what the others were finding. Wood fragments went through radiocarbon dating to establish an approximate age. Stone samples were tested to determine whether their composition matched the island's natural bedrock or suggested material that had been moved or altered by human activity. Metal traces were analyzed to identify their composition and rule out modern contamination from decades of previous digging on the island. Reyes made it clear to the team that no results would be shared publicly until the independent labs had reported back and their findings could be compared for consistency. While the lab work continued, discussion around the discovery kept growing. Historians pointed out that if the underground feature turned out to be genuinely human-made, it could reshape how researchers think about early activity on the island, potentially prompting a fresh look at old maps, ship logs, and regional historical records that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant. Others cautioned that excitement was outrunning evidence, and that the responsible move was to wait for verified results rather than speculate about gold, sealed chambers, or grand historical conspiracies. Reyes himself avoided making bold predictions in public, repeating instead that the team's job was to follow the evidence wherever it led, whether that turned out to be an extraordinary discovery or, just as plausibly, a well-explained natural or historical feature with a far less dramatic story behind it. Before any final excavation pushed toward the suspected void, the team carried out one more full scan of the site, using every piece of equipment they had access to. The resulting model was the clearest picture yet of the tunnel-like structure, its path, its approximate depth, and the unusual chamber-like space at its end. The metallic readings at that endpoint were, if anything, slightly stronger in this final round of testing than in earlier scans, which only deepened the team's determination to proceed carefully rather than quickly. As of now, physical excavation toward that final chamber is ongoing, conducted layer by layer under close documentation, with lab results from the independent facilities still being compiled and cross-checked. Nobody on the team, least of all Reyes, is willing to say with certainty what waits at the end of that tunnel. It could be evidence of an old, forgotten construction project tied to the island's long excavation history. It could be a natural formation that simply mimics human engineering closely enough to fool remote sensors. Or it could be something that finally adds a real, evidence-based chapter to a mystery that has resisted explanation for 230 years. What is certain is that this investigation is being treated with a level of caution and documentation that past digs on the island haven't always matched, which means that whatever the team eventually finds, or doesn't find, it should hold up to real scrutiny.